أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على شمس الوجود العالمين الحبيب قلوبنا الطبيب نفوسنا حضرة محمد المصطفى
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الأنوار الولاية النجوم الهداية واللعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين. Brothers and sisters in the wilayah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On the occasion of the birth of His Majesty Hazrat Imam Muhammad al-Jawad, I would like to first of all, of course, present my best wishes to all of you and focus on the notion of futuwa, of chivalry. Why? His Majesty, when his Imamate was declared to the world, was extremely young, as we all know. And much of my lecture is not going to consist in repeating stories that most of you already know about this, but rather to reflect on this notion of youthfulness that he represented in his life. But if I may, it's really interesting that the Imamate of His Majesty was an opportunity to illustrate a very important point about the nature of Imamate. Imamate is not something that can be acquired by a human being. Imamate is something that, with which basically the Imam is already born with. It's only manifest, so it's declared openly, but the Imam is born with that nature. This, of course, flies in the face of what a lot of reformers at the moment are trying to say about the nature of Imamates. We are at the moment in our own community being faced by external dangers that I do not need here to tell you which ones they are. But we were also facing an internal crisis in the sense that there are people who are within our own communities bent on destroying some essential points of the doctrine of the Ahlul bayt alayhi salam. Things like people questioning the very nature of Imamates, people questioning the very nature of wahy, of revelation, people questioning the very nature of isma, of infallibility, and so on and so forth, of people questioning, for example, the malakuti or the nurwani aspect of their majesties, or people questioning all kinds of different aspects of, not just secondary aspects of our faith and practice, but core issues here. And this has been mostly going on in the 20th century. Imam Muhammad al-Jawad alayhi salam is extremely important precisely because of that, because these questions were being asked already in those days. There were, at the time of His Majesty, people who were questioning the validity of his imamate. For example, people from the Ismaili community who were saying, well, how can this young boy be an imam because he's just a boy? So this correlation, this idea that imamate was somehow the product of experience, that somehow imamate should be something that is acquired and not something is born with the person itself, is something that is a trend that existed already at this time and existed amongst people who were outside of the outside of the community of the people who follow the teachings of the Ahlul bayt. However, nowadays what we have is people who claim to be Shia, who claim to follow the Ahlul bayt, and are actually questioning these essential points. I call them modernists. I mean, people who have basically adopted the agenda of modernity. By modernity, I mean here the cuts, the break with tradition. By tradition, I mean tradition comes from Latin tradere, to transmit. It's unbroken chain of transmission that stands between humanity and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is represented by the Ahlul bayt. So when that link is broken, humanity is lost. Humanity is left on its own without any sort of real guidance. Modernity really tries, what it tries to do is to break the human being away from divine guidance by giving the human being this illusion that we ourselves are able to basically, guide ourselves through this, valley of tears that we call the dunya. So our Imam has not by his teachings, not by what he did, but by his very age itself, has taught us all a lesson. And that is actually quite remarkable in and of itself. And that is part of the divine plan, which actually teaches us this very essential lesson that I think is important for us to remember all. But most importantly, because he was so young, I would like to touch on the subject of the youth, and especially the subject of futuwa, of chivalry. Futuwa, was also called in Persian Javon Mardi, is an essential aspect of the ethos of Shiism. And I mean, if one were to ask what characterizes the ethics of the true Shia, the Shia Haqiqi, that would be Javon Mardi, Futuwa, chivalry. Why is that? Because the Imam, as the mirror of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is also the insan kamil. He is the perfect human being. He is the human being as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designed the human being to be in its fullness. So in the same way as the Imam is the mirror of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the true Shia is supposed to be the mirror of the attributes of the Imam. So our aim in life should be to polish our hearts, to polish our entire being, to become a manifestation, a mirror of the attributes of their majesties. And this, of course, can only be done through jihad min nafs, like the struggle with the self, which is at the very core of the idea of futuwa. Now, what do I mean by futuwa? As you may know, futuwa comes from Arabic root fataya, which describes the idea of youthfulness, of youth, the idea of excelling in virile virtues, such as generosity, bravery, steadfastness, strength, and so on and so forth. The Persian word Javon Mardi refers more to the idea of youthfulness, which stands in contrast with the idea of decay, of death. And we enter here, there's a very fundamental idea in the cosmology, in the view of the world that lies behind the teachings of the Ahlul bayt alayhim salam. Meaning that we are, all of us, caught in a war between the armies of darkness, the armies of ignorance, the Jundul Jahal, and the armies of the intellect, the Jundul Aql. Now, I would like to specify here that the Aql, in the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, is not reason. There's a confusion that a lot of modernists do, but the intellect is something else. The Aql is actually this organ of the heart that enables us to perceive the divine realities. And the seed of it is actually in the qalb, in the heart. Now the heart, for example, for modernists, for the modern man, the heart is the seat of emotion, right? But that in the classical view of the Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salam, the heart is actually something else. It's the core of your very being. And that core in the core of that very being, you've got the aql, which is I would like to translate it as the sacred intellect, that faculty to perceive the divine realities. The Quran calls it also the fu'ad, which is the heart of the hearts. And in the Quran, the word fu'ad is used to talk about, in the context of the miraj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, in his ability during his heavenly journey to perceive the higher reality. So the fu'ad really is that. Now, as you all know, before this physical world was brought into existence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought all of us as in the form of conscious particles, as dhar basically, in front of his presence, and asked us, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? All of these beings replied yes. However, the narrations of the Ahlul bayt alayhim salam basically are very clear about the fact that there were all these beings were also questioned about the nubuwwah of His Majesty Hadrat Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. They were also questioned about, and to which all basically replied with yes as well. And then they were asked about the wilaya of His Majesty Hadrat Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, to which only a minority replied yes. And here you have this division that goes that happens even before the physical world is brought into being. We have already this division into two camps, into two different armies. And it's important to keep this in mind, because you see, the project of modernity is to transform this dunya into heaven. But that is not really what the nature of this world is about. And this world is actually a battlefield. And this war will only be solved and it will only be ended with the reappearance of His Majesty Hadrat Sahib Zaman Ajal Farajahum. And in fact, the project of modernity, by trying to transform this valley of tears into a heaven, is actually, in fact, rebelling against the divine project. So when we ask ourselves, about the state of this world, about the state of constant oppositions between these forces, we very often forget that this is actually the very nature of this dunya. We're not here. This is not a resting place. This actually is a battlefield in which each one of us has to choose between the different armies. And all of us find ourselves in the same situation as Hur ibn Riyahi, basically, rahmatullah alayh, where we have to choose between basically either the camp of the Imam or the camp of his enemies. Now, what is interesting here is this, is that at the same time as the narrations about this division of the beings into a majority of negators of the wilaya, who are opposing a minority of followers of the wilaya, we also have narrations about the very nature of what these armies are about. So there's a list of attributes, a list of virtues that describes the army of the Aql. So Aql being the head general of the army. Then you have the notion of good, and the notion of courage, the notion of generosity, purity, chastity, and so on and so forth. And then you have an opposing army with Jahal at its head, ignorance at the head of the army of darkness, and then you got evil, and then of course a whole range of negative qualities. Now, each one of us is caught in that battle. And this is a very important point I'm trying to make here. Being Shia is not really about a social identity. Being Shia haqiqi, actually means that in our very being, in our actions, in our spirits, in our minds, in the very core of our beings, we actually are in line with the attributes that characterize the army of the Aql. So I'll give you an example. I may call myself a Shia in the dunya, but for example, if I'm oppressive towards, for example, my wife or my sister or my mother, I'm no better. The haqiqah of my actions is actually that of the killer of Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. Or for example, if I usurp the rights of someone else, I'm no better than the thief who took away Fadak from Her Majesty Hazrat Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. So even though I may claim, exteriorly to be a follower of Fatima al-Zahra, my actions, the haqiqah behind my actions actually say in which army I really am. And likewise, when my entire being transforms itself into a river of generosity for my neighbors, for my loved ones, but also to for everyone else, the haqiqah behind my action is that of Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam. Or for example, when as a young man I'm able to preserve my chastity against all odds in a world full of temptation, the haqiqah of my action is that, of my actions of my being is Hazrat Yusuf alayhi salam. So it's very important to keep this in mind. I find that very often we get carried away with a social identity, but we don't really understand that the philosophy of tawalla and tabarra goes way more than just basically uttering a certain number of phrases and slogans. It is actually at what really matters, and it's something that, for example, Khaja Nasruddin Tusi, rahmatullah alayh, in his very famous treatise on tawalla and tabarra, keeps saying, tabarra and tawalla, there's a dhahir and there's a batin to those actions. In the dhahir, it consists in condemning and cursing the enemies of the Ahlul bayt. But in the core of my being, tabarra consists in doing jihad min nafs. It's to rid myself of the characteristics of the enemies of their majesties. So there needs to be a complete balance, and what we practice what we claim to practice outside. So the claims that we utter with our tongues have to be replicated in the very core of our being as well. So this war in which we are engaged is not a matter of choice. It's really is the very nature of the world in which we live in, which of course then brings into question the whole idea of, is it possible to claim to be Shia without exerting the attributes of futuwa, of chivalry? And the answer is very clear that it's not possible to do that. If we look, very often we make this mistake because of the influence of colonialism and because of the influence of the overwhelmingly secular and Christian worldview that has dominated the world since for the last 300 years. We tend to view our own religion through the lens of, let's say, Protestantism or Catholicism and so on and so forth. So we, for example, very often make the mistake of seeing our Imams as some kind of scholars who used to sit around with a turban and and issue fatwas. Of course they did that, but they were also businessmen. They were also people who trained in martial arts. There were also people who had an artistic activity. If you can look at for example, we have samples of the handwritings of the Aima alayhi salam, and it's very clear that the tashayyu doesn't really correspond to the idea of what we modern people call religion. In my own courses at university, when I'm asked to define what tashayyu really is, and I keep saying this, is that tashayyu is an order of chivalry dedicated to Hazrat Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. It's not a system, it's an order of chivalry. And of course, this changes the perspective of things. So if one sees tashayyu through this in this way, one, for example, will avoid committing sins not just because there's a law saying that it's forbidden, this kind of system idea. But if I use the idea of chivalry, I will abstain from that sin because my Imam is my king, and I want to be able to stand in front of my king with a minimum of decency and a minimum of honor. I don't want to dishonor His Majesty. There's a mentality, there's a slight change of mentality that brings in a completely different flavor to the way we practice our faith. And that is replicated, all throughout the lifestyle of our Imams. And especially for young men, in an age where the very fitrah of manhood is being questioned by modern ideologies, it's very important to emphasize what the very nature of manhood is according to the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. Now I'm saying this because the problems that we face in our communities, which of course are common to other communities, especially amongst the youth, between men and women, stem from the fact that the very notion of masculinity and the very notion of manhood is being questioned by the world around us. What does it mean to be a man? I mean, is it just, being born with a certain, being born a male, human being doesn't really make you a man. Becoming a man is a part of the whole entire process of bringing about these qualities that are already in us. But Javan Mardij, Futuwak, goes well beyond that. It's really to move from the stage of the man to becoming a gentleman. If we actually look into the ideals of what the Ahlul Bayt used to teach about what they saw as the ideal of a real man, it's very close to what we had in the 19th century or in the Middle Ages about the notion of the gentilhomme, the gentleman. Someone who's able to be strong yet flexible at the same time. Someone who would be courageous on the battlefield yet at the same time generous. Someone who would be able to face his enemies in the eyes but also at the same time display the ability to perform, to be artistic, for example. So, and our Imams themselves manifested that beautifully, and it's very clear that they asked us to engage in that lifestyle. 2 years ago, I was in the United States, and I was asked, now, why is it that in our community, so many young men are afraid of claiming or saying that, they follow the Ahlul Bayt, that they're, quote unquote, Shia? And I said very clearly that because we do not follow, in our lifestyles, we are not following what the Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salam, basically taught us in terms of the lifestyle of a man. For example, and that is something that a lot of people seem to forget, our Imams were very clear about the fact that it's they place a lot of importance on a certain number of very mustahab activities, such as, for example, martial arts. We have hadith, very clear hadith about the practice of archery, of horsemanship, of swordsmanship, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, what the modernists are trying to do now is that their argument is that, well, the Imams wanted their Shia to be, fit. No, you don't practice these things just to be fit. And very often what these people then do is that instead of actually practicing these martial arts that as taught in the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt, what they then do is that they justify it as through this reasoning, they justify then spending a lot of time like playing football or spending their times in their entire afternoons in the gym and so on and so forth. I'm not saying these things are bad per se. If you want to play football, if you want to spend your time at the gym, that's fine, as long as you don't end up like telling other guys like, I really like your muscles and so on and so forth. That's really, yeah. I kind of very often when I see comments like that, I'm like, but here's the thing. Behind all of these battle arts, martial arts that our Imams taught us to practice, there's a wisdom behind them. Take, for example, horsemanship. The horse is an allegory for the nafs. Our nafs amara, is basically like a horse. So if you give it too much freedom, it won't obey you. If you repress it too much, it will rebel against you as well. So there needs to be a balance in the way we engage with the nafs, and that is precisely the path of the gold, of the middle path that basically our Imams taught us. Or for example, take archery. Archery requires a lot of concentration and actually trains the niyyah. It's really a training of the niyyah that is behind archery. Swordsmanship is a reflection on the notion of death. I remember a few. When was that? It was in 2000, and in summer of 2000. I was in India. I actually bought myself a real sword. I remember the awe that I had when I actually bought that sword, and actually I was shaking because I realized I actually could kill a human being with this, and it confronts you with I actually could die as well in the process. But there's this idea of confronting yourself with the idea of mortality. And one of the important aspects of the culture of futuwa, as taught to us by the Ahlul bayt, is for example, the reflection on death. Our Imams used to very often bring out their own kaffans and basically look at the kaffan and think about death, and they would encourage the Shia to do it. Or for example, as you know, there's the mustahab prayer of Fajr involves, it's a 2 rakat prayer, and involves you lying like a corpse, after the 2 rakat. And it's the notion of reflecting upon your own death. And of course, and I don't want this to be interpreted in a controversial way, but the beautiful practice of tadbir. I don't want to engage into this whole discussion over whether it's bad or not. I do it myself, so you know my opinion about it. But here's the thing. During the act of tadbir, you wear your own kaffan. And again, it's the idea of confronting yourself with basically with your own death. Now, what is interesting is that at that very moment, the question you're asking yourself is, in what kind of state will I present my soul to His Majesty? And that's where your only option you have is to transform your entire being, your body, your nafs, your heart, your spirit, everything, into a cry of love for the Imam. So your entire life should be a reflection, should be an echo of that. Again, this is what I've just said about tadbir. You're completely free to have your own opinions about it. I'm just trying to make a point about the idea of reflecting on death, and that being a part of futuwa. So the practice of swordsmanship is something that is extremely important, and this is something that Imams practiced. Now, why do I keep talking about this? Because these physical actions connect us to this ideal of masculinity, of chivalry that our Imams taught us. And I think my own personal opinion about this is that it is only through this way, by reconnecting to the lifestyle of the Imams, that we can actually reply to the crisis of masculinity that we have at the moment. Very often, and I hear that constantly, regarding our own community, it's just, where are the men? Yes, of course, we have a lot of people who actually were born with, males, But where are the men? Where are the knights of His Majesty? That is the question we have to ask ourselves. And there's a whole training for that. Let's just look at the beautiful tradition of the Zurkhane in Iran. It's a lifestyle whereby you combine spirituality and physical training and the notion of wrestling. And the Zurkhane was an institution that went well beyond just physical training. It was, for example, with young men had difficulties getting married, the men of the Zurkhane would basically gather together and try to find solutions for that young man, gather money for his wedding, and so on and so forth. So it's a social institution that's extremely important as well. Now, all of you here are living in a city called London, and you have the amazing privilege of being in a city where you have a Zurkhane, you have all kinds of different types of swordsmanship that are being taught. You have Japanese swordsmanship, you have eskrima, Filipino eskrima that is being taught in London. You have, of course, classical European swordsmanship that's being taught as well. You have all kinds of other martial arts. You have some of the best centers for Japanese archery is actually in London. And I would really, really encourage you to basically take the opportunity that you have of living in London to actually engage in these activities. But it's not just that. I mean, the physical aspect is the physical aspect, and I'm talking here about the martial aspect of Futuha is there. But then, of course, there's also the necessity of combining that with basically the practice of the arts. As you know, in the culture of the samurai, there was this notion of a lot of the samurais engaging in poetry, calligraphy, painting, and so on and so forth. And that was not just seen as a luxury, but because on the battlefield you would witness so many horrors that you actually had to wash your soul through beauty to bring in some kind of balance into your life. The arts are not a luxury, they're not a unnecessary aspect to our lives. They are as essential to our souls as oxygen. It's something that I keep repeating over and over again. Allah is the beautiful one, and He loves beauty. And again, in a city like London, you have the opportunity of engaging in courses in the practice, for example, of Arabic and Persian calligraphy, for example, or Western calligraphy as well. I would really highly encourage you to pursue that as well. Why? Because our Imams wanted us to be complete human beings and not just restrict ourselves to thinking that religion is just this one aspect of life where you pray, you fast, you pay alms, you pay zakat, and that's it. No, there's no real division between these different aspects of life. And of course, what I'm trying to say here, I don't want the sisters to be left out by what I'm saying, but the reason why my focus has been on this issue is because it is only through us regaining the sense of what the Imams consider to be true manhood, which is chivalry, that we are able to basically bring about and help the sisters bring about this idea of the dignity of the mu'minah. In the same way as I talked about the viewing Tashayyu as an order of chivalry, if the true Shia is a knight, then the true female Shia is not just someone who adheres to a certain number of teachings of the Ahlul bayt, but she's a lady in waiting of our queen, Hazrat Fatima Zahra alayhi salam. The hijab is actually a privilege that has been granted, to them by, through the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a gift, not just an obligation, but it's really a gift, a privilege. And it changes the perspective of seeing these, the practice of our faith. And it's only with us, men and women, reconnecting to that lifestyle together, that we're going to be able to face and reply to the challenges, both external and internal, that basically face us as a community. I hope that what I've said has some kind of wisdom, and that you will be able to think about it and apply it to your lives. And of course, I'm speaking to myself first in what I've just been saying. And I ask you humbly to forgive me for any mistakes or any shortcomings that my presentation might have had. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.